Well, well, well. Where have we heard this before? I'll tell you, we heard this last year, because 1 year ago we made a video talking about this same guy and the potential of him joining the Montreal Canadiens. He is, and okay, yeah, I was about to say was. He is. He's a very accomplished NHL player. He is a Stanley Cup champion. He is a Conn Smythe winner. He was an MVP in the quest to winning the Stanley Cup back in 2023. Today we are talking about Jonathan Marchessault, everybody, Nashville Predators phenom, a guy who was super accomplished with the Vegas Golden Knights as both an original misfit and an inevitable Conn Smythe winner, a guy who produced a heck of a lot of points for this team and bolstered up 90-plus playoff games with the Golden Knights over the past 8 years or so. Marchessault has been very accomplished in the National Hockey League. And last year, he had 69 points in 82 games played, fresh off of his Conn Smythe victory in 2023 and Stanley Cup Championship, before he became a free agent and before he had signed with Nashville, where he had 56 points in 78 games played. Now, you might be looking at Marchessault and the Predator stint that he had this season and saying, yeah, that's not that bad of a point production metric, and it's really not, especially when you consider that Marchessault had really similar production with Vegas the same season he had won the Stanley Cup and won the Conn Smythe. I get it, he is getting older. 34 certainly is not on the right side of development here, but this is still a player who, with his small frame and nimbleness in the offensive zone, his work ethic, and his skill set, this is a guy who has been a very helpful piece for Nashville, even though the Predators still kind of stink. It's kind of weird. They added Jonathan Marchessault, they added Steven Stamkos, but they're in this position right here. So now, thinking about Jonathan Marchessault as a potential trade chip, this has been brought to our attention via the folks on dailyfaceoff.com. It was Frank Seravalli, so thank you, Frank, for going out there and bringing this up. But if you head over to yesterday's trade targets board for the NHL offseason, you will see Jonathan Marchessault listed as one of the top guys. He's in the top 5 over here. Let's read what it is that Seravalli writes about in regards to the former misfit Jonathan Marchessault, top 5 on the trade board, right wing Nashville Predators, 34 years old, 56 points in 78 games, who has 4 years remaining with $5.5 million a year. After a disastrous 28th place finish, the Predators need to get younger, in a hurry, and they'd also be smart to shed one of their long-term commitments to older players too. The belief is that Jonathan Marchessault is moving on after 1 year in the Music City. His production dipped, like everyone's, as Nashville struggled to score. But he is eminently capable of bouncing back with a 30-goal season with strong value to cap. Now, there is nothing wrong, in my opinion, with Jonathan Marchessault as a player. He was just bestowed with unfortunate circumstances on a bad team that was on the wrong side of 30 and that tried to give them the offensive push they needed to remain competitive, only for it to totally backfire in their face and not get the actual results they were looking for. With this in mind, Marchessault is still a valuable offensive tool, and it's why we are talking about him as a potential Montreal Canadiens trade target. Why? Here's why. Because of what Frank Seravalli mentioned on the Daily Faceoff Live show after the article was put out onto the internet. Take a look at this. Seravalli says that Jonathan Marchessault is open to the idea of being traded this offseason. Montreal would be a favorable landing spot, he says on Daily Faceoff Live. I think in a perfect world, Marchessault would love to go to the Montreal Canadiens and go home. I don't know how open they are to that, given the term on his deal, but you could see him helping a pretty good offense already to take that next step. He seems like a true Marty St. Louis type player, doesn't he? And yeah, that's true. Jonathan Marchessault, a small Quebecois guy who happens to make really good things happen out there on the ice despite his smaller stature and limited physical frame. Marty St. Louis probably would love this kind of a guy on his team. And guess what? The best part is, both Marchessault and St. Louis are Stanley Cup champions. Now, they aren't both Conn Smythe winners. Marchessault had that honor when he won the cup, but Marty St. Louis didn't. That was Brad Richards that year. So that's got a, nice little trivia fact for the '04 Tampa Bay Lightning. But Marty St. Louis coaching a guy like Marchessault, that would be a total match made in heaven in terms of what these two people were capable of as hockey players in the National Hockey League. And for Marchessault in particular, I'm kind of thinking, of course, this is not a center player. He's not an option at center for the Canadiens if he were to be sent over to Montreal. But if you were in a spot to potentially think about Demidov translating his skill set to the middle and trying things out at center, if you are confident in that sort of evaluation for Ivan, would it not be reasonable to assume that a line of Laine, Demidov, and Marchessault would actually be somewhat effective here? You get very little work ethic and north-south forechecking play out of Patrik Laine, but you get a lot of that out of Marchessault. Ivan Demidov being the straw that stirs the drink, the playmaker who does everything and who opens up all the space for his guys, that can be a really interesting line combo. And I understand that not everybody would be too comfortable with the idea of Demidov at center, but this guy is proving himself to being an elite NHL prospect talent that, until it doesn't work, I want to see whatever it takes to get this guy in as many roles as possible, seeing whatever hats he can put on as a member of the Montreal Canadiens hockey team. If it's coming out later this season that Ivan Demidov is actually an underrated center option and he could play that position long term, then okay, it's better to discover that now than to discover that later on. Unless, of course, you wanted to go the slow burn route where you're not really too comfortable in giving him all the minutes and the opportunities right away, and thus want to get him comfortable with just being a winger first before saying, okay, now we'll try you at center. It's only really coming out of a place of a necessity as well, because the Montreal Canadiens desperately need a second-line center with Kirby Dach out and about. But Marchessault being an option, and Seravalli saying here that he would want to go to Montreal, that does align with all the stuff we had heard about last year, saying that Marchessault would be interested in heading home to the Montreal Canadiens in the first place. But that $5.5 million AAV contract is an obstacle. And while it is true that a 50, 60, 70-point player costing $5.5 is very good value, you just aren't really too confident in Marchessault being able to do that for the remainder of the deal that he is on, because it goes on till 2028, 2029. I think next season, and probably the season after, you're most likely looking at Marchessault as still being able to produce in that range, but nothing is guaranteed at this point. So ultimately, I wanted to ask you, the viewer out there watching this video, what is your thought process on Jonathan Marchessault as a potential Montreal Canadiens trade target? Is he the second-line center the Habs need? No, unfortunately he's not. But he is a player who could be available on the trade market, that the Predators could start looking towards shopping, and a guy who could be interested, or according to Seravalli, would probably be very interested in heading over to the Habs. How do you respond to all this? Let me know in the comment section all your opinions. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sign on, and bye.